Welcome back everybody for video 2 of the Guns of August, this classic game. Alright, the Central Powers are going to begin the game first, and here are the phases in short order. The War Declaration phase is where the player, the Central Powers player, is going to declare right then and there what neutral countries, which are not at war, they're going to be going to war against, if any. Normally, the standard historical course is to invade Belgium neutrality, and historically it was called the Schlieffen Plan. The next phase is the supply determination phase, where you look at your army and you see if they're in supply. Now, normally that or a unit is in supply when it's within 5 spaces of a city that supplies, a supply city, which is basically on the map. So basically, if they're within 5 hexagons of space, they're in supply. Also, if they're in a railroad that has an unbroken path that's not in an enemy zone of control that goes through to a supply route, that also is considered being in supply. I'll go over the rules more specifically when we get to the actual gameplay. The next phase is the movement phase, where you're going to be moving according to, you can move either according to railroad movement, which is basically if you're entrained and in a railroad, you can go 24 hexagon spaces on the western front and 16 on the eastern front. Or if you're moving based on your regular movement counter, you're going to be moving according to the number given on the actual unit value. Like, for example, this is a cavalry unit from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. The last number, I don't know if you can read this, is 224. 224 just means 2 attack value, 2 defense value, and then a 4 movement value. So that's basically your movement value through common terrain, not considering any of the modifiers and terrain modifiers, which we're going to go over too when we actually show a close-up of the actual gameplay. Alright, so we got after the movement phase is going to be the combat phase, which basically has combat with the 2 different types of combat units. There's basically combat units and combat support units, which can be combined. We'll get to that in more detail. Basically, it's more or less a situation where the combat units have the ability to retreat. The combat support units don't have that capability, so you have to make decisions about things like the artillery, the siege artillery, and artillery is basically a support unit. Alright, it says demoralization removal phase is when, and it has to do with battle. When you actually are demoralized in battle, when you retreat, you're going to be demoralized, like when you have to do a battle. That refers to the previous turn. If your demoralization removal phase basically refers to a unit that got demoralized in battle during the last turn, not during this turn, during the last turn. And then the isolation phase is when you check to see if what's going to happen to units that are not in supply. The supply determination phase, which is number 2, has to do with marking units which to determine if they're in supply. If they're not in supply, then they're isolated to a certain extent. And in the isolation phase, those units which are not in supply are basically either destroyed. Depending on the rules, they're either destroyed or they receive an isolation phase marker if they're not the kind that are immediately destroyed. And that's based on an isolation phase is the only phase in which units can actually be destroyed based on not being in supply. Also, if you're not in supply and you just receive an isolation marker, like certain units can actually be out of supply for a while. They can receive like a 1 or 2 isolation value. They lose half their attack value, but we're going to get into that later. And then after that, it's the Allies' turn to have the exact same situation as the Central Powers. They're going to go through their war declaration phase to declare war against neutral parties, the supply determination phase to see if they're in supply, how close they are to a city that supplies them, or connected to a railroad that is connected to a city that supplies them. Then they're going to move according to, like, once again, either railroads or through their own movement power. Combat, demoralization, removal, and then isolation. But then there's something called the interplayer turn, which both players go through. The naval phase, which is, because we're going to be using the add-on rules from the general magazine, the mega variant, we're going to be using all the naval rules, and it's quite a lot of stuff. We're going to actually go through that article and read it too. Morale phase, which is really interesting. You're going to roll to see, based on how much damage you've already taken, you're going to roll to see the morale of your nation, if it wants to continue, if they're going to mutiny and things like that. Reinforcement phase, receive certain amount of reinforcement points every turn, no matter what. And the key, I think, to this game is how you use your reinforcement points. You're going to receive so much, replacement points. You're going to receive so many reinforcements according to a very specific historical chart, and you're also going to receive the ability to actually dedicate replacement points. Are going to be points that you can dedicate secretly to what you want to actually build up. And then whenever you build up something, there's so many scheduled turns you're going to get your units, when you're going to have to wait to get those units, and then you have to put them into the game immediately based on the schedule, or you lose them. Then there's the game turn phase, and then the weather phase. And then there are some rules for that too that kind of affect. Weather affects mainly like things like the movement of like siege artillery, and whether you can get automatic victories and stuff based on the weather. Like normally if it's mud, you can't get like automatic victories based on superior numbers. Okay, that's for the summary, and we're going to get right into the gameplay next turn. Not next turn, next video.